Well, no, it'll come in the next bit.
So we're going to move directly now to item 14, and as I said to staff, to council before, I'm going to have to leave shortly, but I'll stay for another few minutes. All right, now the recommendation that we have from staff is that we received the report and request that staff provide a report back within 1 month to a council meeting detailing the program of work that will be undertaken in response to the recommendations in the independent expert panel's report. There is a notation there that the staff report omitted a paragraph under the details for the council resolution, which was relevant obviously to the presentation we've had, that LIM notations following receipt of the peer review report be reviewed, acknowledging the findings of the report. Would you like to, Brendan, speak to the proposal to come back with a report and perhaps give us an idea of the program of work that would be undertaken? I'm not expecting you to advance your thinking in that area, but just to explain the process.
Sure, just to note Maurice Hoban from GHD as well, who's led this process on our behalf, and if need be, Maurice can talk to both the process and also, probably most importantly, the learnings from that process that we would look to continue to apply to maintain the positive engagement that's occurred over the last couple of months, and obviously Judith from our legal team as well. So in short, the staff recommendation is based on receiving the final peer review on Thursday, Friday last week, and what we particularly mindful of in the lesson that the peer review in fact includes is not to rush these decisions, but we do need to move as quickly as we possibly can on this. What we've proposed is to take the recommendations from the expert panel, and the expert panel are very clear that their recommendations are different from their findings, and again are different from their suggestions for the 10-year review, and they explicitly state that the recommendations are the parts that they're expecting that the council actions. We've been working for some time on the basis of the draft reports, and now having received the final report, we'd like to come back to you in the very near future to outline the program of work that would give effect to all of the recommendations from the expert panel peer review. It would likely that would then be in a situation by the end of the year or early in the new year of having completed what's described by the expert panel as phase 1, which would be the scientific report. So we appreciate the position that we're in at the moment. We're not quite at the position of having completed the robust scientific analysis to the level that we expect in all areas, and I think everyone's in agreement that completing that piece of work is the most critical part before we can move on to phases 2 and 3, including the recommendations from the expert panel on the conversations with the community, and the need to have the conversations about adaptive responses. We think within a month is a reasonable time frame. Obviously the report back will also include the issues that were noted in the 10 December resolution about the LIM notations, but we also want to make sure that we get that right.
Yeah, I've had an alternative proposal around the LIM notations. In terms of the proposal that just was made, that we form a partnership with the CCRU to ensure that they are fully engaged in the process, which ultimately will lead to the development of a new chapter, coastal hazards chapter, for our district plan once the replacement district plan is in place. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I think it's just the expert panel makes reference to kind of withdrawing planning maps. Just to be clear, the Tonkin and Taylor report is effectively what will become the Stage 1 scientific report. is a long way from planning applications and inclusion in the district plan. So the Order and Council removed the coastal hazards from the district plan, but we do still have an obligation through the Standard Resource Management Act processes to restart that process as soon as practical. I think the wording in the OIC is, but that wouldn't
Isn't
start...
that after the replacement district plan is in place?
Yeah, that wouldn't start until we're both through the district plan review process, and also you need to start with stage 1, get the science right, and then have the conversations with the community in stages 2 and 3 before you get to that level. So that's some years away. I think the question I was asking was about the proposal to have a more partnership approach with the community rather than, because we were under a pressure cooker in terms of time. So it was a relief when the government agreed with us to withdraw. Oh, absolutely. So Morris will jump in as well, but just very briefly, the kind of learning here is you want to do this with people, and you want to make sure that the community is engaged through all of this, because I think, as Tim said, it's been a very difficult time and everyone's learning through it. So we certainly appreciate the understanding from the community and from CCRU in terms of the lessons that have been learned, and there have been mistakes and learnings that have been made through this. We don't want to rush the process unnecessarily so that we make either new mistakes or we repeat mistakes of the past. So our commitment is to maintain the engagement that we've got, and maybe on that point I'll just ask Morris to talk about just briefly about the lessons that you would see us applying over the next period.
Thanks, Brendan. More than happy to. Look, I do have a number of slides, Chris, if you wanted to talk that through. It just sort of talks through the process undertaken and some of my views, I guess, around the lessons that have been learnt, and what you might want to do and sort of consider to go next.
Well, I'm going to have to go, which is a shame.
No, look, Leanne, I think the sorry, Madam Mayor.
I'd much rather be called Leanne than Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Leanne. I fully endorse that. Look, there's a process that's been established. And what I think would be a crying shame is that if that process wasn't built on, and there was continued momentum gained around it. I would counsel everybody around ensuring that there's ongoing communication, and that we don't wait until the start of the end of this district plan review and when you start that process. I think that's the lesson that's been learnt within Kapiti. They did wait, and there was a big vacuum and void in between, and that created problems. And I guess that's my recommendation.
Just the one other point that I wanted to make before I left, if you could scroll up to the thing. Now, I know that David's got a different resolution than this, which is different from this, but I kind of wanted to put it on the table. I mean, people can move it or second it or whatever. I won't be here. But what I've taken is noting the recommendation of the peer review panel to remove the hazard maps until the legal requirements of New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement are complete, because the current mapping may be legally unsound, which is a quote from the report. Direct the Chief Executive to urgently review the coastal hazard information that have been placed on Land Information Memoranda and report back to the next council meeting. Now, that's not a month, that's 2 weeks. And the advantage of doing that is that you can come to a council and say, do this even though you legally can't. But actually, if we legally can't do something as a council, then I don't think we would actually be acting lawfully. I mean, we wouldn't be acting in accordance with our obligations under the Local Government Act. But this directs the Chief Executive to do that urgent review and to report it back to the next council meeting. I don't think it has to wait until the programme of work report is prepared, because there are very clear considerations, and they're quite separate from the work that's going to be ongoing. But I've just put that up there, and I'm going to leave Vicky to chair the meeting. I'm sorry, but I have a prior.
Is that what Do you need a second?
No, I can't move something.
No, I appreciate that, but would you have moved that?
No, I've put it up as a,
Right.
if there's a mover and a seconder.
Right, okay, right. Okay. Do you want to run through your slides, Horace?
Vicky, more than happy to, if that's going to help.
Is that useful? Okay, thank you. And then we'll take questions if that's okay.
Thank you. Look, I'll try and run through this as quickly as I can. I just want to cover broadly the process, my observations of what's worked well and what to consider, and some of my thoughts as well on what you might want to try and consider doing next. So this is just a reminder where we started, and the key here is that a terms of reference was developed with the community to look at the science as well as the regulatory and legal framework that was undertaken. And I think that was just an important conclusion that came out of that engagement process with the community. And look, my role, and thank you, Tim, for acknowledging me this morning, but I have to point out that that my role is to be independent and to work with the community and with council and councils. In fact, even we've had a discussion with government and MFE just on Monday, and I think that's been really good, a process of bringing different parties together to work with the community to develop terms of reference, appoint a peer review panel, and support the panel to deliver its final peer review. This is now complete, and I think that's a key message that we have not had the opportunity to put more broadly out to the community yet. So just since the last time that I was here talking with you as elected members, we have gone through the peer review panel has been appointed, there was a draft peer review report undertaken, and that final peer review, and it's been heard by council here today. What I wanted to do was give you a flavour of what's happened in between, and I think this is, my view is this is important because it's setting the groundwork and framework for how you can continue this going forward. So my view is that there's been, developed a broader understanding of the science and the regulatory drivers. So when starting that dialogue discussion with the community reference group, and I even look back 6 months and some of those meetings we had with the community, and also I guess with councils and Environment Canterbury and councils here, there's a broader understanding, and particularly understanding the regulatory drivers and sort of process that's occurred that's led to the situation that's here. I think the councils and the community have started to come together, and I say the word started, and I was fortunate enough to be involved in a meeting where the community reference group that I've been working with and the council and Environment Canterbury and councillors, a number of you here, were at, and I thought that was very encouraging to see, and I saw a lot of consensus and a lot of willingness to engage through that process, and I think that's fantastic, and I'd like to see that continued. So there's been consensus building, and there's been consensus building even around the findings of the panel. Now, believe me, it's quite an unusual process to ask a group of experts to provide an expert opinion and then have the ability to review that and provide comment back to them. That is a unique situation, and one that I think actually really helped through this process, because what I saw was in undertaking that looking at that draft and feeding that back was some consensus building, and consensus building around what the panel had to say and their opportunity to sort of feed back into that. Willingness to collaborate, I've already sort of talked to, and also helping to shape that national direction. It was really only one discussion that's had with government around it, but I'm starting to see that sort of willingness. So this is great that the situation that's happening here in Christchurch is actually being looked at and being considered amongst other communities across the country and also at national government. But fundamentally, there's recognition this is only one step forward towards a better understanding of the hazard, of the science around it, the risk to communities, and the actions that council, communities and residents might want to take, and I would suggest want to take collectively. I put this up because it's kind of a reminder for me of what it was like 6 months ago. because I stood up in a number of meetings with a number of people that were here, and there was outrage. There was frustration, and there was a lot of no unity, really, in terms of kind of general direction forward. And it looked a lot like that to me in terms of different members all in a room. Now, I wouldn't like to suggest that what's happened now is that there is absolute unity going forward, but I hope that most people would agree that that at least most parties are sort of pointing all together in a sort of similar direction. What I don't believe is that perhaps all parties are as far ahead as what they'd like to be right now, but I think this is a good building block to start from. A concern I have is that really it is only one part of Christchurch that has been through this process, and there is a much wider community out there that need to be involved or aware or understand and be given the opportunity to collaborate through what happens next. We've heard from one of those groups here obviously this morning. So my key message is don't stop, please. Build on the process and collaborate to build mutual trust and broader consensus on the direction forward is probably my main parting message. And some things just to consider in doing so is you've got a community reference group. So we've had 3 members of CCRU as part of that community reference group, and there's been others from Diamond Harbour and Akaroa and other parts of the community as well as being part of that group. Now, it's representative of the community that's been impacted through this report, but it's not necessarily representative of all of Christchurch. It's experienced, informed community committed group, and I thank them for the time and effort they've put in. And I also want to thank the time and effort that the expert panel have put in, because it's been considerable. When you think of 5 experts having to come together in this way to produce what they've done, and I for one, are grateful to receive the report. So keep in mind, one thing I would like you to all kind of keep in mind is there is a risk, though, that this learned group who have worked with in the last 6 months have grown, are much more aware of the regulatory framework that needs to be sort of worked within, as well as the kind of science and other issues around it. I guess my issue, something is a potential risk is, and keep in mind, is there a growing gap between that group of learned people and the rest of the community, and something that perhaps needs to be considered. Finally, this is all about natural hazards, and the hazards and risks that need that need to be understood, and they need to be understood and owned by the community. Without this, it's always going to be difficult for individual property owners, or for community groups, or for councils to make decisions. So I would, again, I'd encourage you. This is a broad discussion around multiple hazards. It's not just something here to do with sea level rise. The final 2 slides I've got is, one is just a reminder of we sat down as a community reference group and worked through what was out of scope as part of this terms of reference. I just want to remind some broad headings of what was kind of out of scope. And that's, those are the actions to address the risk. There's still a desire out there, and a lot of respondents that came in saying, look, we want some action around this risk. And there's still that feeling out there. There was a lot of discussion around the economics and having some robust information around that, and also around LIMS, although that's obviously what is on the agenda here to talk about. I guess my view on LIMS is that no matter, regardless of the LIM outcome, the hazard and the risk is still there, and it needs to be continually understood, communicated, discussed, and if required, taken action. So that's still there. So whatever the outcome is in terms of the LIM, that kind of discussion needs to continue. Why I wasn't engaged was part of overwhelming response that came right at the beginning of this process, the desire for kind of national consistency, but also the recognition that actually flood impacts and new information since earthquakes sort of need to be fed into this, and we're well aware that there's other kind of processes going on. So this is my final one, please bear with me. So my thoughts on what happens next. So don't please go into a vacuum, continue to engage, work with the community. I would suggest you've got a community reference group there to work with, that you could work with to agree a response to the final report. And I think there's the opportunity to do that in the weeks to come. On the council statutory requirements and how they feed into that, on the continued development of the science, and on how a wide, how we engage with the wider community. I think this group could probably help think about how you could engage that wider community. Just keep it moving. Thanks, Vicky.
That was Glenn, Phil, Yanni, Paul. Did you have your hand up? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Paul. Glenn, Pauline, and then.
Thank you, Morrison. Thank you. Got to get used to these new mics. Thank you, Morrison. Thank you to your group for all the hard work. I'd just like to pick up on something you've just said, and it's becoming quite apparent that where a lot of us would see the hazard and risk and the limb going together, I'm hearing with what you've just said, the hazard and risk remain, but it's what have you picked up? It's over the conversation over the limbs. So what I'm hearing is with the limbs, it's there's a dynamic here over it's what the council's doing to the community. So the hazard and risk is still present, but it's this problem over the land information memoranda. That's the dynamic at play, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I accept the findings of the panel. I mean, that's their findings, and I'd accept those, and those are the recommendations that have come forward. And whatever the other legal and other ramifications of that, I think do need to be understood. And I think if there's a time frame around that can be worked through, reported back, that's great. But I think what's clear to me from the report is that they are not saying, as part of that report, that that the hazard's still there, and there is still a risk associated with the community that does need to be understood and discussed and engaged upon, and that's the other significant finding I see.
It's not a new question. I mean, this arose at least between the earthquakes. I mean, I remember these conversations between September and February in the Burwood Pegasus ward at least. Now, what's going to go on our limbs? So these questions were being asked, way back then. It's always been this. What's the council going to do next? So, yeah. Pardon?
Is that a question?
Well, no, it's not a question. No, it's an observation.
Oh, thank you. Well, look, mine's along the similar lines, Morris. When you talked about consensus, what are we agreed on? What does the community group and the report agree on in a nutshell? The role of the community in this instance, in terms of the community reference group, was to come together and put a terms of reference to the expert panel. So that was and that step was undertaken, and it's the expert panel has responded to that brief, and that's what the report's come back. So that's the process to date. That is the process, I guess. I thought you were talking about this consensus between the community forum and the findings in here.
No. There's been no discussion around. Well, there's been discussion around the draft that came out from the findings of the peer review, at that time the council and the community and Environment Canterbury came together just to discuss those broad findings and give some feedback back. What we fed back as part of that was the consensus view that was discussed at that meeting.
And the main disagreements then?
We didn't discuss disagreements. The whole point of that process was to look at consensus feedback to give back to the panel.
Okay, and just quickly, my second question is looking at page 10, number 27 here talks about beach profile data, and accordingly we suggest that a Pegasus Bay coastal monitoring analysis report, including careful analysis of beach volume indices, is produced before the first assessment of the coastal hazards assessment. Now, who would do that assessment? Is that ECAN?
Just to be clear, so my understanding of the first reassessment is what's been talked about is the 10-year reassessment. So what we would propose to report back in the first instance is the recommendations that the expert panel say that we must do immediately, and I would assume that suggestion in paragraph 27 is probably replicated in one of the suggestions that the expert panel have made for the reassessment. So we would absolutely get to those things in due course.
Right, so that's a 10-year one.
But we haven't, in the last 3 days, turned our attention to those issues.
Right, okay. And would ECAN do that work, or do we do that work?
We haven't turned our attention to those issues as yet.
Okay, because I guess that's where I'm going to. That's going to have to be a collaborative process between all the...
Well, the expert panel does quite correctly say that there needs to be far stronger links, and certainly from the community perspective, the distinction between what ECAN does and what the councils do needs to be stronger, and so we would expect to do the majority of the work in conjunction with ECAN.
Yeah, and also it does say to keep in touch with the central government updates as they become obvious. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My first question is in relation to what Morris's comments in relation to this issue being like a really good beginning has been worked through on a consensus basis with this community who are directly affected, but also just how in fact you'd suggest that we as a council engage with the wider communities who are also in Christchurch who are also affected. Have we, or is that something which will be considered in the report which will come to us? So I'm really talking about future engagement processes.
Yes, so thank you. Again, this is my observation and opinion. So it's my view is you've got a group of people who are actively engaged in this, who all along have also been providing advice on how to communicate with the with the wider community impacted, and I think you have the opportunity to develop that in collaboration with with a group. How it goes, how you go about doing that, there are examples and models around from other cities who've worked through these kinds of issues, but I think you've got every community is a little bit unique and it's come from a different starting point, and I think you've got the opportunity to work collectively to work those kinds of things out.
Thanks, Morris. My second question is in relation to the legal work which may be required, because clearly we as a council need to work within that legal framework which the Mayor referred to. So Judith, I guess I'm asking you, is that also information which we would get in the report? And I would assume clearly that will relate to the LIMS matter too.
Yes, well, I can really only speak to the LIMS matter, not any other legal obligations in terms of our RMA planning requirements. But
that's the key legal part we need.
Yes, so we do still have to comply with our obligations in Lagoima to put information on LIMS about hazards that we know about. So how we do that in light of this new repair report is what we still need to work out, the stuff we still need to work out.
Thank you. And my last question, I'm pleased to know, Brendan, I think this is for you probably. Can I just take it that the further work which will be done, and I'm assuming that the report actually will summarise what needs to be done, and it will be around the recommendations that the panel have particularly made, and that they're in relation to the coastal erosion hazard zones and some modelling and that other work which they're very specific. Will the report also refer to those areas of, I guess, risk and erosion which we've been asked to do? Will there be a summary in the report we're going to receive around that?
Without wanting to preempt what we're proposing to come back in the very near future, my general position is we've asked a panel of experts to provide us the expert opinion on what should be done, and I've come back clearly and said you got more work to do, and so I'd be very surprised if we didn't as quickly and robustly as possible do all of the things that they've recommended that we do.
Right, thank you.
The programme of work will outline how long that'll take, and we want to make sure that there's monitoring, and as Morris says, we want to make sure that there's continued engagement through that the next pieces of work.
Good. Thank you, Brendan.
I just have a question under item 3. In terms of the chief executive having the ability to amend the LIM, so my understanding is that that currently exists. So why would we need it reported back to council? Could we not just actually ask the chief executive to amend the LIM as soon as practical, based on seeking that legal advice?
Yes, you could.
Right.
That's in fact what the 10th of December resolution C, which is down the bottom there, that limitations following receipt of the peer review report be reviewed acknowledging the findings of the report.
Yeah, so I'm asking why it needs to come back to council rather than just the chief executive making those changes now, or, you know, and what was a realistic time frame for her to make those changes based on this report?
Point number 3, I think, is that's the suggested resolution that the mayor put up before she left. Is that right?
Yeah, but that doesn't give a time frame for changing. Sorry, I'm just in the middle of asking a question. That doesn't change the time frame, or give a time frame for amending the LIM. All it says is to report back. So all I'm trying to understand is if we wanted the chief executive to get on and, you know, we've got the peer review, to amend the LIMs based on the findings of the peer review, what's a reasonable time frame? What time frame do you need to do that?
Well, we've suggested the staff recommendation is that we would report back within 1 month. Whether or not the chief executive would have made a determination within that 1 month on what to change the LIM notations to is a matter for the chief executive. So,
well, can I just?
Well, essentially, I need to take into account a whole range of things. So there's advice, there are recommendations in the report, peer review. There is advice as well, which aren't actually recommendations but suggestions. There's a statutory requirements, and there's the other information that I have. And I would have thought you might be interested in terms of what I might amend the notations to be.
I would have thought so, yes.
Right, so we had this debate quite a few months ago when actually we got the chapter withdrawn from the district plan process, and some of us were quite keen to, as councillors, make the decision to change the LIMs at that point. The advice we had back was that actually it wasn't appropriate. Mm-hmm. So given that we've heard from the community today that they're interested in us putting it right, then I just think it would be really good to have an understanding of a really clear time frame for that to happen as soon as possible, rather than have a continuous kind of reporting back mechanism.
That's not what's suggested. It's actually reporting back what my decision will be, and it is a staff decision. It's not a council decision to alter the LIM.
So what's the point of you reporting back on a decision that you've made that we can't change?
Well, you might be interested, that's all.
But we could get that in a memo, or we could get that in a formal.
No, I actually think it should come to the council. I think that's right in terms of...
Okay, so well, can we be clear in number 3 then, that the point of that is to decide on the wording that will go on the LIM?
Sorry, but that's not the council decision in terms of the wording. That's my decision or a staff decision.
Well, okay.
Okay, so
the second... Okay, so the second question is of staff. What's happening with our hazard strategy? Where are we at with that?
wait a minute, can we just focus on this? This is big enough and hard enough as it is. Have you got any questions for the guys down there?
Well, I mean, basically, if you look at what some of the recommendations are in terms of a way forward, it's really clear that CCC and ECAN move towards integrated management of coastal environment. That's under the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, Policy 4. And I would have thought that the natural hazards strategy was actually a key part of that. So we don't have any reference to that in here. And I would, like to...
So do you want to comment on that, Brendan, or shall I get Carleen to?
What the time frame is around that?
More than happy to report back within a month on how those things are addressed.
Okay, and you'll just undertake to do that? We don't need to amend this?
No.
Is that...
Right,
yes.
okay.
We don't need to amend it.
Right, okay.
So, and the final question from me is just the New Zealand coastal policy statement, what I'm trying to understand is one of the criticisms, as I understand it, is that the work that Tonkin and Taylor didn't really explicitly deal with what that was. So we've heard that, and I think one of your slides said, central government direction was important, but my understanding from reading this is central government already provided very clear direction around how we deal with coastal policy issues through that coastal policy statement, but that wasn't incorporated into the work. So do you have any understanding why that wasn't picked up? And, is it that we need more direction from central government on this issue, or is it just that we didn't follow the direction that they'd already provided?
Well, I think the crux of asking an expert panel to produce a report is Morris's side. The three people sitting in front of you aren't coastal hazard experts. So I think that's a question, if it's a technical question, that's probably best directed at the expert panel. But it's suffice to say that the expert panel have made their recommendations, and our commitment to you is that we want to get on and action those recommendations.
So, but one of the comments that was made in the presentation, and I don't know if you want to flip back, was around central government direction. What I'm trying to understand, is there a need for more central government direction on this issue, or is there actually clear enough guidance already around it?
So central government are undertaking a review of their national guidance in relation to this matter at the moment, and that process is just ongoing. They're expecting that process to result in an outcome before the end of the year. That's the time frame they're working to at the moment. So those things are changing as they are, based on lessons being learnt from various communities across the country. But there was, there were national guidance in place in the 2008 guidelines from government, and there was statutes which has been commented on by the expert panel.
So
Okay.
why did we miss that?
Paul?
First of all, thank you, Morris, for the work you've done. I went to the last meeting with the various partners and people involved, and I think you did a great job on actually pulling those people together. The question I have is around the hazard mapping. Do you believe that they will be found or could be found legally unsound?
Maybe to save Morris, it's a relatively kind of speculative question.
Well, it states up there they could be legally unsound.
Well, the expert report on page 58 of the report states that.
So if that's the case, would we not remove those current mapping from the limbs until that extra work is done?
We're definitely looking at changing the limb notations to the extent that they reflect the mapping, changing the comments
So you're going to do that
to address that issue. Not necessarily.
Well, there's a potential that these are actually unsound, the issue. But could we, if we decide to legally, could we actually remove those from the limbs now?
That's a decision for staff based on the information that we have.
You're asking legal advice from that, and probably something you want to report on rather than just do on the
Yes,
spot.
and we are looking into, we think the comments need to change, what they change to. We need to look at all the information that we've got now and the comments at the in the.
So you haven't done that to date?
No, not yet. We're in the middle of looking at it.
Okay, is there any other questions? Dave?
Look, clearly the biggest issue around this whole debate, or the debate that's going to ensue shortly, is around limb notations. And 3 up there in the proposal is a slightly watered down version of the recommendation that I put forward. Leanne has the habit of bringing legal bits and pieces in. My question, and it probably goes to you, Judith, really, is the fact that it appears that I can't put up a motion that we remove the notations from LIMS because it's a legal responsibility of the Chief Executive. What, if any, redress does Council have if the Chief Executive and staff take a different viewpoint to the report that's before us and the overwhelming sort of community position on this matter?
I don't know.
That's the thing that concerns me,
today.
is that we as a council can't do this.
Is there a question that Judith can answer, because it's quite a big question? Is there a more specific one, Dave?
It's just
or is
here
it
we
just
have
a
a
statement you
report
want to
that
make?
quite clearly says...
You'll have the chance to make statements.
Okay.
Is there... Right, okay. Okay, so we've got... If that's the end of the questions, let's move on to the resolution. Is there a mover and seconder for what's in front of us?
I'm happy to move the resolution. I have a bit of resolution around 3, but I think I can
Totally understand that. Dave moves, Glenn seconds. Yeah? Okay. Is there any debate about what's in front of you?
Yeah,
If
I
not,
want to speak to it, yeah. I'll speak last.
So, a speaking order?
I wish to speak last.
And so you don't want your moving, right, you want to reserve that for the end?
Oh, I'm only going to speak once on it.
Okay, so Glenn, Phil, Yanni, Dave, is that it? And Paul. Paul before Dave.
Okay.
Okay, go Glenn.
All right. Thank you, Vicky. Just by way of my views here, I'm not going to take too long, but just looking at the timeline of events, and this is a general broad sweep over what we do know, beginning with firstly the promulgation, if you like, of this information in the first place over hazards led to arguably disempowerment of residents most affected, although this is about the whole city. The pushback led to peer review, which has been carried out. There's a question now, at least one question of where this process leaves the status of the land information memoranda. I suggest the status is not, I do support these recommendations, but I do suggest the status is not secure, and while the science is under question, there's a truck and trailer effect. So if the science is under question, what does that do to the status of the LIMS? We have to get the science right, as has been acknowledged. The communication with the community is paramount. In that respect, through the local community board, I did put forward a principle which Tonkin himself had talked about, and that's kind of peer reviewing the comms. So the community's actually taken on board to peer review how, because a lot of this is the process over how information is disseminated. Finally, why? Because there are questions over the science, there are questions over the process. Talking with residents in Sutton Place in Dallington, one comment was, every time you, as in council, every time you do this, so whether it's hail information, flooding, hazard, risk, whatever, it just pushes them down. So it's that's what's become quite apparent in the information today, that it's not only just the information, it's the process. The residents were first disempowered by the seismic events, and what we did added to that. So I do support this. I have questions over the status of the LIMS, given that the science is under question and the chapter is removed. How we could change, I don't know, you'd have to perhaps bring about changes to the LGA, David, to change that with regard to staff. But I support this today and urge your support as well.
Okay, Phil, were you next?
I also want to thank you very much for all the work that's been done on it, Morris and the staff, and also the local communities. And I think that the work that's been done is a really good model, notwithstanding the mistakes that were made. And I think that there's no doubt that, as is in the report, that the mapping should have been draft mapping as the first stage towards the district plan, and that the hazard maps, that it's acknowledged those hazard maps should really be withdrawn until the final mapping, and that's what this recommendation does. But that we do that carefully and on the advice of our Chief Executive. The point has been made that we've got to do the right thing. There's no question of that, and we need to. We also need to get this right. And clearly this has been a complicated scientific, not only exercise, but in terms of really difficult for the community and will be difficult for the wider communities as we have those conversations. I think, though, too, it's important for us as councillors to be clear that this report is wider than just the whole LIMS issue, clearly. That may be the front page part of it, but there is information here which is incredibly important, I think, in terms of future decisions that our council will make. And there are clear recommendations, and we'll get an outline in the report, as staff have told us, of work that will be completed before the results, which would inform the next stage of our district plan. There's recommendations there in reference to more information to be worked on around the whole open coast of Pegasus Bay and the dependency of those beaches on the state of the Waimak River and the sediment supply. So the review panel, the expert people, are asking for further information on that. And I think it's extremely important that we're clear too, that it's essential as a council we work with ECAN, and in fact that actually happens. Another recommendation in the report. And also that how in fact the different communities are considered and how we all have to in effect have what's called adaptive management, so there's an integrated approach for our whole coastal management. And it's important that that work informs any council projects which we undertake, probably particularly in the coastal area. And the coastal erosion hazard zone and the mapping to be reviewed is going to be done for the next planning stage. And I think it's essential, if we look at the stability of the dunes, for example, that's referred to clearly in the report, that we take that long-term coastline dune movement, that also be reassessed. And as a council, we get clear information on that. Because the report is clear, there is some uncertainty around that sediment budget, and the report recommends further examination, including some clear modelling, so that in fact we get, I guess, clearer science. Because some of the report describes the current sediment assumptions as being optimistic. So there's no doubt that as a council we also want to be reassured around that. This report also refers to the combination of hazards, not only what is on the coast, but it refers to the fluvial and the pluvial, but also all of the coastal flood hazards as well. So, in short, I think it's really important that as a council, besides the LIMS issue, which we will get further information on, and I think are dealing with effectively, and so that we absolutely get the LIM part right too, there's a need for us as a council to take all of the natural hazards into account around our future decision making. In that sense, this is now a very valuable report.
I want to thank the community for the huge work that they've put in, and also to the panel. I think it is appropriate that we get a more detailed report back, and we've got some pretty short time frames to get that information back, so I support that approach. I think it's important to recognise that we can actually, the Chief Executive can actually change the LIMS at any time. So, I hope, and obviously with number 3, we're given 2 weeks to report back on that. So let's hope that we can get some idea of what's happening within that time frame as well. I think, to me, this highlights some fundamental flaws in terms of the district plan review process, and it's interesting to reflect on the work that's been done with the community over this coastal hazards issue, I guess relevant to the other hazards as has been mentioned, but also some of the other major land use planning decisions where the community have largely been shut out from a collaborative process, and that's a real shame. This is, I think, a model. We heard a lot about models previously for some previous reports of being considered today, but actually hopefully maybe this can be a model not just for addressing the coastal hazards but actually addressing land use planning across the city by working collaboratively with communities. I think one of the things that needs to be addressed is communities being resourced to participate in these sorts of technical, scientific, complex processes, and hopefully when we get the report back there can be some reference to that, because I want to acknowledge the huge cost and expense that this process has placed on our community at a very stressful time dealing with all the other things going on in the city post-earthquake. I think the other really important thing from my point of view through this peer review is it highlights very clearly a breakdown between what happens at a central government level and what happens at a local and regional level. And so the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement objectives don't seem to be incorporated in, and hopefully we can get some understanding as to why that wasn't put in place through the initial work, and what other things we need to do to make sure that in future it is. But also, if you think about Christchurch, you think about the extraordinary amount of money being spent on our infrastructure, the extraordinary amount of science we're putting into our understanding our natural hazards, and a kind of lack of a holistic approach around that. So I think it's really urgent that we get a holistic approach around our infrastructure strategy based on a response to the natural hazards and risks that exist in our region. And I think, again, that should be quite a comprehensive document, because it is very hard to see in terms of things like the skirt repairs why some communities are getting a lot of money spent and others are questioning why, when they're not getting the same level spent addressing some of the risks around things like seawalls. So it'd be really good to tidy that together and to have a really clear strategy for the city as to how we deal with what I think most people accept are the very real challenges of sea level rise, climate change, and the natural hazards that exist. So I'm happy to support what's being put here today. I think if things can happen quicker, like the limbs, for example, then there's no reason why we should wait for 2 weeks. If we can get memos sent around, or if things can be done in the meantime, I would welcome that. But thank you to the work that's been done from the community and from this panel, and to the consultants that were brought in.
Look, I endorse most of the comments my colleagues have made here, but it's indicative really of a process that we were forced into through the district plan review, a truncated process that would normally take 15 to 20 years to complete. So it's not surprising that we made some mistakes along the way. I led 5 of my colleagues to meet with the Associate Minister to ask to get the coastal hazards policy removed from this process, so we could take some time and work with our community. Thankfully, that was accepted, and we're here today after an independent review. And it's good to see the council can step back and say, look, we've got some things wrong, and we're actually willing to do something about it. And I think that's a really important step for any council, that they are willing to take up that mantra and say, we've got it wrong, let's do something about it, let's work with the community and find a way forward, noting that we have got issues around our coast. What they will be and how they will roll out in the future, that's why we need adaptive management rather than set in stone policies that actually dictate what may not even eventuate. So I'm really happy to support this here. I'm looking forward to seeing the Chief Executive's outcome, and again, a big thanks to all the people involved, including the community, who actually have taken a lot of time, and we know how much time that costs to a community and the stress it places on them at a time when we've got other things and other issues in our life that we need to be dealing with.
Thank you. Look, this has been an exceedingly long journey for me, and starting back in early 2015 when the Tonkin and Taylor report was presented to Council. I raised a number of concerns about the report then, and was the only councillor to vote against the adoption of the report. The report in itself led to the basis of planning mapping for the district plan review, and by virtue of its adoption, the council was obliged under the Local Government Act 2002 to place information on limbs reflecting that the council was in receipt of coastal hazard erosion zones and coastal hazard inundation zones information for a significant number of Christchurch properties. Considerable angst was felt in the coastal community about this action, which then gave rise to the establishment of Christchurch Coastal Residents United, a great deal of lobbying, and finally government withdrawal of the Coastal Hazards Chapter from the in favour of developing a national standard for addressing sea level rise. An independent peer review process was adopted in 2015, and we have its findings here before us today. I'd like to take the opportunity to firstly thank CCRU for their tenacity and well-presented arguments that greatly assisted the process for the withdrawal of the Coastal Hazards Chapter from the DPR, and secondly, the Community Reference Group for their excellent work in establishing the questions, and finally the questions for the peer review panel and their recommendations for that peer review panel composition. The many hours of work that group has voluntarily contributed has been phenomenal. The findings of the peer review panel are, in my opinion, well thought out and very well presented, and I commend the panel for their work. I do feel vindicated for my stand on the matter. The report has many recommendations for work that needs to be completed before we can have absolute confidence in coastal hazard erosion zones and coastal hazard inundation zones that may arise as a result of such work. There are a number of points out of the report that I'd quickly like to highlight. On page 165, the panel found that the report's purpose went beyond the technical assessment of areas subject to coastal hazards as required under Policy 24 of the NZCPS, and they concluded that mapping should have been drafted. Secondly, on page 166, the report was based on one single IPCC scenario, RCP 8.5, which is commonly used in hazard assessments. However, the proposed adaptive stage of coastal hazard zone mapping will benefit from considering a range of scenarios. Sediment supply, Phil touched on this before. The open coastal hazard erosion zone is dependent on sediment supply from the Waimakariri River, and a more robust analysis of sediment supply and distribution is recommended. NZCPS 24 should have been referenced in the terms of reference for Tonkin and Taylor and was not. Quite important, that one. The panel recommends that the hazard maps generated from the results of the report should be withdrawn for now until the final mapping is concluded. The panel made a number of suggestions under a general heading, the way forward, and I'm going to read them. They recommended that the Council initiate the concept of adaptive management to assist all stakeholders potentially affected by coastal hazard risk to resolve issues at large in NZCPS Objective 5 and Policies 25 to 27. Secondly, that the Council require the withdrawal of the hazard maps in the report and put them to one side until final mapping is agreed amongst all stakeholders in the second and third stages of adaptive management. Thirdly, that the Council advise the LIM Authority that the withdrawal of information on LIMs is necessary until the legal requirements of the NZCPS are complete, because the current mapping may be legally unsound. Fourthly, that the City Council and ECAN move towards integrated management of the coastal environment, NZCPS Policy 4. Also, that Council, in preparing the Coastal Hazards Chapter of the District Review Plan, move towards a strategic planning as directed by the NZCPS Policy 7. And finally, that it be noted that NZCPS policies 4 and 7 are mandatory directives endorsed by government. The report further has a summary of recommendations which you can find on pages 223 to 225. There are 23 recommendations. I don't intend to go through them all. Suffice to say, I'm almost finished. Suffice to say that the peer review panel has identified 23 matters that need to be addressed. This in itself signals that the original report was deficient in a number of areas, and CCR and myself were justified in challenging the accuracy of the report. In summary, it's been a long and costly exercise, and perhaps it's a reminder that we should not always accept technical reports at face value, but be prepared to challenge aspects when and where there is an element of concern. I recently attended a seminar addressed by Kayla Colvin, and I'm not that IT savvy and up with Singularity U, but she gave a decidedly absorbing presentation outlining such things as computer capacity doubling every couple of years, but more importantly, advancements in energy storage that were astounding. And I believe that some of these energy storage, things like battery and solar energy, eventually are going to overtake the use of fossil fuels, and IPCC 8.5 relies on extreme carbon and greenhouse levels in 100 years. So looking at that sort of technology, I think, is likely to see some of the factors that generate potential sea level rise being substantially reduced, negated or eradicated. I'm pleased with the outcome, satisfied that my concerns have been addressed, and confident that given implementation of the panel's recommendation that we will have a robust report on which to base further adaptive management approaches to sea level rise. I'm always mindful of the Parliamentary Commissioner's approach to climate change, that we have plenty of time to adjust to sea level rise and need to plan ahead in a realistic time frame, responding to actual change in sea level rather than reacting now to something computer modelling may indicate could happen in 100 years' time. Finally, the unresolved portion of this discussion is centred on the LIMS, LIM information on property titles. There is clear advice given from the panel. The chair of that panel is a retired environmental court judge. The peer review panel recommends the removal until science is right and acknowledging the legal deficiencies. I have some reservations around 3, the legal implications. However, there is a clear expectation from both peer review panel, CCRU and the local community that this information should be removed until accurate science and an agreed position on coastal hazards is reached. The time for procrastination is over, and I expect that the recommendations are carried forward. Dr. Latham, and my final point, Dr. Latham in his address said, final point, you know, we need to avoid any legal challenge to these things. So I would urge that we support the recommendation, giving some reservation to 3, and hopefully we have a positive outcome that satisfies both our community and CCRU. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a reminder, guys, that the speaking time for the mover is 5 minutes. That is, given this, the importance of the issue, I allowed a number of you to go over time. So it's 5 minutes for the mover and 3 minutes for anybody else. Okay?
But you can do it in lease.
Yes, that is definitely allowed. Okay,
It's like a speed limit. You
It's
can.
moved and seconded, and we've had all the debate. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That is unanimous. Right, thank you. It's